The attorney can't make any modifications. The other thing is if a client decides not to use an attorney, they really cannot cancel the contract under the attorney review clause. You as their agent or they themselves can't be like, change my mind. There's no 3-day rescission period. The rescission period only works, when you have an attorney. Then we, get the question that, okay, you've sent out your letter, 3 days is up, are we out of attorney review? Is the 3-day period over? Is attorney review done? Attorney review is not done at the end of the 3 days if an attorney sends out a letter. So basically, what's attorney review? It's us sending out a letter, scary as it sounds, stating we're canceling the contract, but here's your counteroffer. We'll agree, to the contract if you agree to X, Y, and Z, right? So once that letter is sent, that 3 days goes out the window. It's until everybody agrees. And then, of course, that's why it's so important to try and get this in attorney review, get the letter sent out as quickly as possible, and get attorney review concluded. In the last few years, especially my agents that work in South Jersey, where they really don't like us, which is fine, I do things a lot differently. And sometimes we don't send out a letter. I don't need to, send out a letter and destroy someone's deal. But in order to not send out that letter, the contract has to be well drafted. And there's got to be things in there that are not, pitfalls for the buyers. And I've done that many times in sending that out. So we'll talk about some of those pitfalls. We'll talk about some of the easy things that you can do to kind of avoid, delays in dealing with issues. So basic stuff, deposit. So from the buyer's end, you've got your deposit, and then what I see in contracts a lot of times, you've got a contract that you've offered on October 1st, and you have on there, deposits due by October 5th. And here we are, it's October, 15th, and the seller just kind of got around to signing the contract, and now all those dates are stale. Do not, in my mind, do not put in any dates for the initial or the second deposit. Reason being is because those dates are already pre-printed in the contract. If you leave it blank, initial deposit's due in 5 days. If you leave the second one blank, it's 10 days. All right, so it doesn't, in my practice, when you're the seller's agent, seller's attorney, what you're looking for is you're looking for the amount of the deposit, and the date. We then fix an attorney review. When I represent the seller, all my letters are going to say the deposit is due the earlier of 5 days after attorney review, or it's going to be due prior to inspections, right? So we can do that in attorney review. But if I'm representing the buyer and I really don't want to, and I want to get this out of review, before you're sometimes out of the process, you're already technically in default, like your buyer's already late. So just leave those blank if you can. Obviously, if the other agents like I want to see that initial deposit right away, no problem. Have them, give you the deposit check. From the seller's end, when you have a listing, really important to make sure that deposit has been paid prior to inspections. We deal with hundreds of contracts. We put that in our review letter. But as agents, we know when our seller is opening up the door for inspections. We can double check and say, has that deposit been given? Really important because if the deposit's not given, that's their skin in the game. So we always tell our listing agents as well that the deposit really matters. I don't want you don't want $1 million contract with a $10,000 deposit. Easy to walk away from that, especially now where you've got everybody waiting appraisals. And if you're saying I'm willing to pay $150,000 over asking price, you're probably willing to walk away from 10 grand when it really super under appraises. So it's good when you're on the seller's end to make sure the deposits are higher. When you're on the buyer's end, obviously it's a different different concern. I'm seeing a lot of you know, I have a $70,000 or $50,000 contract with $100,000 deposit. Try very, very hard not to get 100. You know, deposits max should be 10%. You know, what are we looking at when we're sellers? You know, and the best buyer, well, the best buyer's cash, but the best buyer has got a big down payment. The best, you know, you've got a good strong deposit, but that deposit is not the down payment. And sometimes, you know, I've seen, you know, a little bit of mix up with that with agents. You know, the down payment is the difference between, you know, the mortgage and the purchase price. It is not the deposit. The deposit's part of the down payment, but that basically has got to be the amount that your client is willing to walk away from if they freak out, change their mind, and don't go to closing. So, so that's important. That's important to know. Mortgage. My one big suggestion with mortgages is please don't fill in that date. The contract says if you don't fill in the date, that it's 30 days. 30 days from the contract date or 30 days from the end of the attorney review. I am constantly trying to, you know, using the same scenario. You gave your offer. At that point, you're like, okay, 20 days, 30 days, you know, by the time it's accepted, by the time it's out of review, those days are already stale. And what happens if that time runs? So if you've got a mortgage contingency date of 2 weeks, first of all, in most cases, there's a few lenders I work with that can do it. Most cases that time, it can't be done. So what happens at the end of those 2 weeks is that the seller could be like, okay, contract's canceled. And in this crazy market that we're in, sometimes sellers are chomping at the bit to do that because while you're under contract, somebody else came in with a higher offer and they're just looking to, you know, for an excuse to cut your client loose. That is the easiest excuse to do it. You know, we've done it. It's, you know, I've seen people do it. So you want to have a reasonable time frame. Again, you know, just leave it alone. Just don't fill in that blank. Obviously, if you have a situation where you've got an agent saying, I want to see this, the mortgage commitment in 20 days, put that period in, you know, it's, I don't know how you guys write in dates, but you could say 20 days after contract date. But the date, it becomes a big issue.
Now, can that date, be extended? Could the attorney,
well,
you can send a letter saying
we're right, we do. We extend
yeah.
that date, but again, my goal is,
try not to
let just, because again, you're going to have instances where you just want to I just did a, attorney review yesterday on $1 million home. And by the time things were negotiated and signed, I had 10 days for mortgage commitment. So yeah, of course I put in 30 days after attorney review. Well, now you've got a seller who's like, well, wait a minute, I've got a 30-day closing. I'm not going to agree to a 30-day attorney review period. We took your offer because you can close this in 2 weeks or,
Right.
So it makes our jobs more difficult. And at the end of the day, like a lot of this is honestly managing expectations. It's managing expectations of your clients and it's managing expectations of the other person on the other side. So, if you can avoid it, avoid it. Sometimes you can't. And I've had deals, especially my South Jersey deals, where they're like, I had a VA loan recently. They're like, we want a commitment appraisals done in 2 weeks and we want to close. I had a lender that I did it that could get it done. Most lenders can't. And if you've got a lender who can do it and they're not just promising things that are, that are not going to happen, you're okay. Because again, I mean, if that day runs, seller can just, by the terms of the contract, can just cancel the agreement. So that's why you want to make sure that you try and work with that. Other kind of the basic thing of contracts, don't forget the addendums. I cannot stress that enough. You've got paragraph 43 of the contract. You've got these little checkoff lists, condo, septic, well. Sometimes people just cross them off. But don't, and again, and I don't know the technology part of it, of the way your contract networks work, you got to actually complete those addendums. There is nothing in the contract, if you've got septic, that allows your client to, inspect the septic system, deal with septic issues. More importantly, there's nothing in the contract that speaks to well water. Well water mandated by the state. Somebody's got to test for well water. You got to have a well, it doesn't have to be clear well certification, but you need that in the addendums. The addendums speak to that. Condo addendums. one other thing that happens is that we as attorneys, we get a contract. If those things are not checked off, I have no idea if there's well or septic, you know, I have no idea if this is a condo. Now, one thing that I do, you know, when I review contracts with my clients is I go on Zillow and I look at the pictures. First of all, that enables me to say, well, you know, God, you know, this is a, you know, this is a condo, this is this. And then I get to look at pretty pictures and sometimes not pretty pictures, which makes my job interesting. So, you know, one of the things with that, and I'm going to kind of jump ahead with solar, you know, solar panels. I cannot stress enough how important it is for the agents to let us know that there's solar panels. I have so many times, only because I've gone on Zillow and seen the solar panels and the pictures of the roof, have I known that there's solar panels in the home. You do not want to do that. If you've got a buyer and they're buying a house with solar panels, you need to know, is it a lease? Is it bought outright? How much, you know, what are the, you know, ideally you get a copy of the lease. What we always ask for, what we want, and I think that when you're representing, if you're a listing agent, you have a seller with solar panels, get their lease ahead of time, 6 months of utility statements and 6 months of solar statements. When we're the buyers, we want to know exactly what they're getting into. These solar leases, they run the gamut. Some of them, quite frankly, are awful. Some of them are good, and few of them are good. And there are just, you know, you run into all these problems, you cause these delays if we just don't know what the information is. We typically always put in there in our review letters that once we have all the information, we have 5 days to cancel the contract if it's not acceptable, if those solar documents are not acceptable. But again, you know, you want to make sure if your buyer can know, you know, what it is. I mean, if, you know, some of these things are like, you know, $250, $300 a month, and you're like, okay, well, maybe if my like electric bill's $5, then it's maybe not that bad, and it's not. So you want to make sure you have that information right away. And also just kind of backtracking a bit is that when we get the contracts from me, I think it's incredibly important to speak to the agents, because you're the ones that are going to tell us about the background of this file. You're going to tell us, you know, how many years you've been working with this buyer and driving them around, you know, 7 days a week to show houses and change their mind. And, you know, I get a pretty good sense that way. You're going to tell me how difficult it was to negotiate the contract. You're going to hopefully let me know that there were multiple offers and, you know, what the background is, whether you're the seller or the buyer. And that informs my decisions on how I'm going to prepare my, you know, review letter. When I represent sellers and there's multiple offers, I absolutely hate getting letters from attorneys that are 20 pages long, and I've got a condo and they're asking me whether or not there's underground oil tanks, and they just press print. You know, and sometimes, you know, sometimes I know as attorneys and the agents, I'm like, get this letter out, but you don't want to throw out this, you know, letter that's nothing to do with the file. And, you know, if I know that there's been, you know, 10, you know, other offers for, you know, cash buyers, and you're really lucky to even get in there, I have to modify my letter accordingly. I have to modify, you know, I have to know what the expectations are of the sellers and of the buyers. So it's incredibly important, you know, to communicate that. So, all right. Inclusions, exclusions. One thing I just want to point out about that, you know, fixtures are included. It's important to know what a fixture is. You know, your light fixture, your built-in appliances. Refrigerators, washers, and dryers are not fixtures. They're like toasters. Sellers can take them. So if your client wants a refrigerator, washer, and dryer, please put that into the contract. Really important to do. All right. Or, you know, I always, you know, when I'm representing the sellers, for the sake of clarity, I'll always, like, you know, exclude them. But if they're not mentioned, then they're not included. So, inspections. So that is, of course, kind of where a lot of deals die. And I think it is incredibly important to understand what the limitations that everybody's now throwing into the contracts mean. So important. It's one of the things that I see all the time is for informational purposes only. What does that mean? And I can honestly tell you that when you're speaking with clients and you're speaking with agents on both sides, no one really has a clear idea for what informational purposes mean. It just sounds really good, right? So informational purposes, as is. These contracts were as is when it was buyer's markets. As is just means the seller doesn't have to fix it. They never have to fix it. I don't care if your house is falling down, you got mold, they don't have an obligation to fix anything, right? So if you're saying to your buyer, you're doing the inspection for informational purposes only. Well, what happens if you don't like the information? Are you just gonna, well, suck it up? Or do you have the right to then walk away if there's something major? Because then we kind of get this constant like backtracking. It's like, well, it's informational purposes only, but if there's something major, I wouldn't be able to walk away. Or it's informational purposes only, you've waived inspections. So if you're waiving inspections and you're not doing any inspections and you have no right, or you're doing inspections and you have zero right to ask the seller to make repairs, that's pretty much a waiver of inspections. If you are saying to the seller, informational purposes only, buyer does not have the right to request that any repairs be made, or seller, no repair request can be made. You need to make sure that's clear, and you need to make sure that your buyer understands it fully. Because what happens is people put in informational purposes only. Seller might be like, yeah, great, well, got information. Now there's an underground oil tank. You happy? If you don't know what your client expects, what you expect, and then it causes so many issues. It causes so many problems. So if you want to use that term, that's fine, so long as you define what you mean by it. And
So you're saying you should fully explain that if they find something that they don't like, that they still have to walk away?
Well, if you use the word informational purposes only, you don't know what that means. It means different things to different people. Yeah. Like your buyer might be like, yeah, informational purposes only. I'm gonna find out you don't have to fix anything, seller, but if something major, I can walk away. And most of the time when I speak with buyers and I see agents put that in, that is exactly what their expectation is. So, and the other agent on the other side's like, informational purposes only. You don't like the information, that's on you.
So how should someone word that?
Well, don't put it in.
I
I really don't think that word, I don't think it's this like, great phrase that kind of came out in the last 2 years where nobody really understands what it is. It just sounds good. So if you want to use it and it makes you feel like warm and fuzzy to use that phrase, then you say informational purposes only, buyer rights to request repairs limited to major structural, environmental, mechanical defects only. Finish the sentence. Finish the sentence, because alone it really means nothing. All right. So
can we backtrack really quickly? There's a question in the chat about the solar panels.
Yep.
Waka, do you want to come up and really quickly ask what your question is? I'm just not sure what the question is.
I was doing a contract for the buyer, and the solar system was a big issue for them concerning the lease, the removal, how much they have to pay, or what's their options of they didn't get enough electricity and they still have to pay for the electricity. Whatever discount was offered through the year was not satisfactory for them, and if they know if they remove it, they have to treat the holes in the roof, and they weren't happy about all this issue of the solar system, and they asked a lot of questions, and I have to go back to the listing agent and ask. It shows me that somebody with no information, which I am, but I want to avoid that next time.
Right. And you know what? I mean, it is a difficult issue because sometimes, we actually have situations where Seller doesn't really know, especially when you're dealing with an estate on the other side. Or if it's, or a regular seller really doesn't even, I have one right now where for some reason they entered in a solar panel agreement and then decided a month later to sell their house. So there's really very little information. So, my client was able to renegotiate with the solar company. There is no standard for these agreements, and I think that that's the big issue. There's not like, okay, this is a lease and it's $100 a month and you pay $50. I mean, some of them, you're making payments and you're covering just the usage. Some of them you're paying money, and if there's not enough, electricity generated, they give you back money, they give you back payments. That's why it's really important to have 6 months of statements. So if you've got, you see, how much money you're saving in the summer versus how much money you're saving in the winter, and then you kind of go and you calculate and figure it out. It's tough, and that's why I think that when you're the listing agent, and really the buyer's agent as well, you got to get these numbers ahead of time. The other thing is too, to be honest with you, like, right now, especially if you've got, new first-time home buyers, everything else, you've got these horrifying interest rates. That's a whole other expense. When they're going to their mortgage company, they're getting a loan. Well, on top of that, I got, $250 lease payment. Now, obviously, everybody recognizes you've got utilities, but it's kind of different when you're looking at like an actual payment, an actual obligation that's on the thing. So it's important to find out about it. It's important to, to really, know what's involved. And like I said, in my review letters, I always put in a provision that we have 5 business days after my client gets all the documentation to cancel the contract if they're not happy with the information. That's all you can do. So it's, I have one I'm actually closing this afternoon where my client just went back to the company and just said, I want to renegotiate it. I'm going to pay it off in full, but I want you to expand the electrical output. I'll pay it off in full, and renegotiate the terms. Not everybody has the ability to pay it off in full, but they have to, know. The worst for us, and I've been there, is when got a first-time home buyer, agent's like, I don't know, I didn't ask about the solar panels. I know they're there. Please, that's the worst. You've got a very disappointed buyer, and it just doesn't work.
I had my closed recently. Really, especially the lease, you want to have a copy of the original installment agreement. You need to buy the buyer as well. Solar company incorrectly issued the conveyance letter and added 15 years to the lease.
Yeah.
They also added a monthly fee where this one did not have a monthly fee. They were using the lease for electricity. And then the other part is on the seller side, you have to understand on leases, the buyer has to qualify for the lease. Qualify for the lease, they can't buy the home.
Right. That's the other thing is too. It's true because they got to run a credit check and they have to approve you, for the lease payment. I just did one. It was ridiculous. There was Trinity Solar. Then there was like a finance company. Then there was an intermediary to go and transfer. They needed to speak to all 3 of them. And the seller, it's just, and honestly, we don't have the time. I don't have the time to get involved in, renegotiating people's solar contracts.
Which is now Sunrun or the other way around.
Oh, God. Yeah.
They will talk to a realtor, or some of them will not without a lease. At least they will communicate. You'll see, talk directly to the person instead of.
And if the seller doesn't authorize them to speak to all these different people or contact them and say, if you need it in writing, I authorize you to speak to the agent. I will authorize you, most importantly, to speak with the buyer. Because honestly, for me, the best way to deal with it, have the buyer call the solar company, ask whatever questions they have. You want them to be comfortable because you don't want it to be on you. And I don't want it to be on me. And to be honest with you, you can't answer those questions. You're not, you can't be like, oh, I looked at it, it's this, it's this, it's this, it's this. It's just, here's all the information. This is the monthly payment. you need to look into this. You want them to talk to the solar company. You want them to ask whatever questions they have, and you want them to tell you they're comfortable. You need to CYA as well. So, just kind of back to the whole inspection thing. You know, so you know, a lot of the language that we see in contracts, you know, major structural, environmental, you know, kind of back to the same thing. And as attorneys, it can be a pitfall whether we're the buyers or the sellers, because again, what is structural? Structural has become this term of art, right? Like what structure? You know, is a window with a broken thermal seal structural? Is the, you know, missing little foam thing, you know, around the, you know, $5 you can buy at Home Depot, wrap around your outside pockets, that's structural. It's a very broad term. And, you know, some attorneys and agents will take structural and say, well, structural is foundation. You know, structural is, you know, is your house falling down? You know, do you have, you know, major structural issues? Yes, a window is a part of a structure, but is it a structural defect or is it a window that doesn't go up and down? And how do you eliminate that? You really can't. You know, I mean, all you could really do again is manage clients' expectations. I think it's really important. So, you know, for instance, constantly the contract says limited structural environment. Then I have a conversation with the buyer. Okay, do you know how old the heater is? Do you know how old the air conditioner is? And you can never raise things that are beyond the useful life. You're buying a house with a 25-year-old heater. Guess what? It's in the end of its useful life. You know, it might die a day later, it might die a year later, but you got to budget that. Period. End of story. Right. First of all, you want, to the extent that you can't control it. You can get a seller disclosure statement to your buyer so they have that information. But if you limited your inspections in paragraph 43 of the contract to structural, environmental, and we're talking to the buyer and saying like, okay, that doesn't include mechanical. So if your heater's broken, right? If your heater's broken, is that a structural defect? It's not a structural defect. Is it an environmental defect? It's not. So if, you know, I don't even want to say if we want to be jerks, because we're not being jerks, we're following the contract, is to say that's not a structural defect. You know, it's not. And how do you know what to really add? You got to speak to your clients. You know, you really, you know, for me, you know, what I tell my agents to always put in is, you know, structural, mechanical, you know, environmental, and safety. That's pretty much the catch-all. Don't forget the mechanical. Don't forget the systems. You want to make it major. You want to make it major structural, major mechanical. That's fine. But you know what's a major mechanical? If your boiler's broken, that's a major mechanical. It's not structural. You know, that's also going to be your plumbing. That's going to be your electric. That's going to be your sewer scan. That's going to be all those types of things. You want to be careful with the language. Sometimes you waive inspections completely. I can't begin to tell you how many contracts I have right now. I think people are nuts. I think they're nuts, especially for, I mean, I did a house, waive inspections, waive appraisal. It had aluminum wiring. It was like, you know, 80, 90-year-old house. I won it, right? Buyers won it, right? It's up to them. There is, and I just saw this yesterday, and I'm going to want my agents to use this. It is a buyer waiver of inspection and or appraisal addendum to the contract. It's when an NJAR forms. I don't need to see it when, you know, it is for you. It is for you. You know, if you've got your buyer waiving appraisals and you've got your buyer waiving inspections, cover your ass and get them to sign that addendum. I've also had a few agents, fortunately not ones that are my agents, but on the other side, we're coming, you know, files under, you know, contracts under appraisal or whatever, deals under appraisal by 150,000, and then come back and sue. So it's great. I just saw this. Don't send it to the other agent. It's really just for you. It's for you to have that your buyer understands, you know, what that is. By all means, you don't want to waive, you know, inspections unless you really have to. But again, if you've got that buyer that says, I just really want it. Never waive a tank sweep in an older house. I mean, even my contractors who buy houses and knock them down and build new ones, they don't waive tank sweeps. And when you have a client buying an older home, recommend a tank sweep, recommend a sewer scan. they're, you know, a lot of them are being done right now. I think it's important to do. You have to play with the language in the contracts. You know, in my mind, you know, you're better off coming, you know, putting in language saying buyer agrees to assume the first $10,000 of repairs, agrees to assume the first $25,000 of repairs, than just doing a complete, you know, waiver of inspections. That, you know, I've seen that work. You know, when I've had the seller and there was a full waiver of inspections and the other attorney was like, oh my God, you know, the agent talked the client into it. Can we like massage the terms in a way? That's usually the way that we kind of get past that. So I think that that's important to do. Well and septic, again, that's really, really important, you know, to make sure that they're signed. Next thing is appraisal. I know pretty much right now, if you want to have a client that wants to buy the house, I'd like to say they're overpaying for the house, but then every time you think somebody's overpaying for the house, they just get more and more expensive. So I don't know, you know, it's been absolutely crazy. You know, when you're, you know, and that's what you have to do. I mean, you know, for me, you know, if the list price of the home is 800,000, you won out a bidding war and it's 850, you know, I'm going to, when I represent the seller, I need you to waive at least 50,000 of the appraisal. You know, don't come in and bid over asking and then say you can't pay over asking if it doesn't appraise. And I think to me that's kind of like the starter. But again, I mean, you got to do what you got to do now, but the client has to know. And one of the things that I have a note in there, you know, people used to say this, not as much anymore, saying, hey, don't worry about, you know, even mentioning, you know, the appraisal. You're not going to get a mortgage if the house doesn't appraise. It all depends on how much money you're putting down. You can get a conventional loan that's as little as 3%. And if you're putting 20% down, yeah, you're going to get a mortgage, even if it doesn't appraise. You've got this huge buffer that you can make up. Now you have an FHA buyer or a VA buyer, great. Don't even mention appraisal because you got the FHA VA addendum that says the property has to appraise. Leave that on the, you know, leave that on the seller, you know, to go and do, you know, to go and deal with that, to go and deal with that issue. Of course, buffers, appraisal buffers are the best thing. If the deal allows it, to go and say, you know, buyer agrees to pay $10,000 over appraised value of the contract price. That's the best thing because then we're managing expectations. When you're the seller, there's an appraisal waiver and the buyer's only putting 5% down. Well, what does that mean, right? Like, you know, they're not going to be able to get their mortgage if it substantially under appraises. So you need to then have proof of funds that the seller, the buyer is able to make up the difference in the mortgage. You're going to have to, you know, take that mortgage contingency down. So you gotta, you know, you have to see how that really works. And I'm just going to mention this really, really briefly, but it's the assumption of the chain loans. I don't know if you guys know about this. You have a buyer who's buying a house. Seller has an FHA loan, which they bought their house 2-3 years ago. It's great. It's 3%. It's FHA. The buyer can assume that loan. So there's a problem. It's going to take longer, but the buyer can assume that loan and, you know, pay that lower amount. The issues you run into is if, you know, that loan was, you know, $200,000 and now the house is, you know, $400,000. You know, you've got this great cheap $200,000 loan. You still got to make up the difference. So, you know, you may have a buyer that fits that. I actually have one right now that got out of attorney review that I was blown away by. $1.75 million home at the shore. My clients are veterans. Their buyer is assuming the VA loan. I had no idea in doing this as long that VA loans are even assumable, but they are. And it's like crazy. You know, they have a 3% rate and somebody's buying this $1.75 million beach house at their 3% rate. You know, who would know? But those things are there. Just wanted to make sure that you knew that that was out there. Permits. Just because you get a CO doesn't mean that permits are closed. All buyers all buyers should do an OPR request. Heaters, air conditioners, hot water heaters require permits. Obviously, if you see a house with a finished basement, there needs to be a permit. It's very simple. I usually, with all my clients, I send them a list after we're done attorney review. I send them either the link to the OPR request or I send them the OPR request form. We encourage our clients to do it themselves. It's certainly very helpful when the agents can do it, but I believe, and your office manager can confirm this, that your errors and omissions policy does not cover you if you get wrong information to your buyer from a third party. So you need to be very aware of that. You want to help them, like, okay, this is the stuff, and I tell them for this and for that, but don't do it for them. Because then you're relying on the third party, or maybe they look and they're like, oh, my agent did this and my agent did this. So that's just important to know. Rental properties. So many people right now, you got rental properties that want to put it on the market because it's a great time to sell. And then unfortunately, so few agents, even if they've been doing this for 40 years, really understand the landlord-tenant law. Right? I'm not a landlord-tenant attorney. I do not want to be a landlord-tenant attorney because it's a minefield. In New Jersey, tenants have all the rights. So just because somebody tells you, hey, it's a month-to-month lease, I'm just going to tell this tenant to go away and I'm going to sell my house. You know, the lease is up in, you know, in whatever, November 1st. Great, listed November 1st. You cannot do that. You can't. If you have a month-to-month tenant, that month-to-month tenant is entitled to stay for as long as they want to, unless you can get rid of them under statutory grounds. It's the lease, and they're not willing to make, the payments. Sometimes some places have limitations on them. The way you can sell that house with a month-to-month tenant is that you can sell it. You have to sell it to somebody who's going to occupy it as a principal residence. Then you have to send the correct notices to the tenants stating that we're selling the house. We sold the house to somebody who intends to occupy as a principal residence. Here's your 60 days. You're supposed to move out. That is one of the statutory grounds that you can set. And then the tenant has to move out. They're going to give you a hard time. It's a horrible time for tenants, for everybody who's nowhere to live. But that is the way you need to do it.
So the best way is to sell it as an investment property.
No. Well,
No?
yes, that is the best way.
The best
if
way
if it's a good tenant, right?
Right, and
Right.
say, here,
Yeah.
you got tenant, you have investment, here you
Yep,
go, and
absolutely.
take it over.
Absolutely. If you are an investor and you're buying the property, you can't get rid of that tenant, unless that tenant wants to go. You can't get rid of that tenant. So you've got to make sure that it's a good tenant.
Put it on the market when the
Can
tenant.
I,
Oh, yeah, that's great.
That's
That's
probably
that's always the best.
the
That's
best
always.
way.
can I ask you a question about this?
Yeah.
I have a case in my hand. She's looking for a rent. She agreed on the sale, but she refused. She's unable to move and find another place. But the new owner wants her to move, and she has a lease. What she could do?
I'm not sure I understand. She has a lease, but she can find a place.
She has a lease, and she's unable to move. She wants to pay higher rent, but the new owner wants her to move. What she could do?
Well, so she's under a lease. The seller sold the house to somebody and there's a new owner. Is a new
Yes.
owner investor?
The new owner asked her to leave.
Okay, the new owner asked her to leave because he wants to put in another tenant or because
Yes.
the new owner is going to leave. Okay. He cannot ask her to put in leave. He has no right to ask her to leave.
He has no right to ask her to leave.
He has no right. If you have an investor that bought a property with a tenant that's in there, especially, first of all, if you're under a lease, if you are selling a property and you're still in the middle of the lease, you can't even sell it to somebody who is who's going to live there as a primary residence because it's subject to that lease. You can't ask somebody to break their lease. But if you sold it, whether it's under a lease or whether it's a month-to-month tenant, and the new owner wants to get rid of this tenant because they want to put somebody in who's going to pay a higher rent. They cannot do that. They have no right to do that.
Okay,
You know, not, the penalties are extreme. If you do that improperly, you are responsible for 3 times the tenant's damages, counsel fees, and costs.
okay,
So, yeah, and that's exactly why I'm saying, you really got to know this stuff. And when you're listing it, and there's tenants in the property. And by the way, just because it kind of defies common sense doesn't mean that it's not, that that's the law, because, anybody would think like, yeah, the lease is done, it's a 1-year tenant, and month to month, we're gonna tell them, give them 60 days notice, we're gonna tell them to leave, we're listing a house for sale. Can't do it. So,
okay.
no, yeah, sorry. What do I have here? I have.
What's the deal with the Ewing?
Oh, the Ewing stuff? Okay.
Yeah.
So, Ewing, for many years they did this, but now they really streamlined the process. They used to have the CO inspector come out with like the tax assessor, and they were like, ooh, this house looks really nice. We undertaxed it. So now we're gonna tax more. In some towns, they just have this with West Windsor. It was like, seller, you finished the basement without a permit. Then yeah, they're gonna go back. But Ewing is gonna basically be like, oh, this is pretty floors, pretty kitchens. I see a fireplace. Well, fireplace was there obviously a long time ago. Ewing will charge a retroactive tax assessment. They will go back and they will charge an assessment going back for way before the contract, sometimes the year before. They will charge that. There's a process. I think you guys use Keller Title Foundation.
Keller Title sends an Oprah.
Yep,
They
exactly.
will, Ewing also has, if anybody's business at Parkway Village, which is by the high school, it's about 4 blocks. They did a special assessment on the whole 4 blocks. And when the Oprah comes back, I had one where we could close in taxes with $3,000 more than what we let the other one be, and the tax collector was not aware that the tax assessment increased, and that's who we had spoken to, which is similar to what you're alluding to.
Yep. The title company will do an Oprah for you. If your client wants to use their aunt and uncle's, title company that doesn't know what they're doing, which happens and you don't do it, it's off. You want them to find out with Ewing especially, and I forgot his name. The tax collector will confirm whether or not.
Jeff Berger.
Yeah, yep, they'll confirm whether or not there's any retroactive tax assessments or what you need to hold in escrow. So that, yeah. But, the same thing with your buyers, the last assessment date was, a long time ago, and now you've got this, taxes will go up. Ewing, taxes will go up.
So when does the buyer find out what their taxes are gonna be or how much they owe?
Well, it's a risk. I mean, it is a complete risk.
In Ewing, you can do the open quotes, have them ask if there's any special assessments that
Right.
are done, because the tax collector had no idea that they did it right next to the
I've spoken with tax assessor's office. They use the same Zillow that, I use. And they look at it. And they're like, did I look at this? Did I look at that? And buyer finds out. And usually it's like a couple days before closing. And there's nothing you can do. I mean, really, you can look maybe at the tax record and be like, okay, last time assessed in this year, and now the house is all improved. Yeah, I mean, but it's also an expense on the seller, because the seller now has to pay those retroactive
I was
taxes.
gonna say, does the seller do
Yeah,
a retro?
he does.
Okay.
Not
Kind of same as new construction.
Oh, right.
well,
So-
right.
they don't know
They
the
don't know,
tax
and
bill
but those
has
are
to-
land-only taxes, and you kind of have a general sense, but like with this, it's
Yeah.
like, it's just kind of like, I think it
Surprise.
should be this,
Right,
I think
right.
it should be that. So, yeah, so that happens. Final stuff with, closing. Some of the stuff is said, some of the stuff, you got a buyer that's a cash buyer, please remind them to get homeowners insurance. We do that, but sometimes, they're like, oh, I don't have a lender, you need homeowners insurance. I just spoke with a new agent before here, coming here, $1 million+ house. She didn't know about the mansion tax. Does everybody know what the mansion tax is? If it's $1 million or more, buyer pays 1%. Okay, so important. All right, you know, you're telling your buyer 1.1 million, you know, you're paying that for the house. Well, now you're at, you know, $11,000 out of pocket in addition for closing costs.
And that's at closing?
That's a closing, 1%. So seller always pays a realty transfer fee, but if you're $1 million and higher, it's 1%.
That's strictly residential or then commercial as well.
I believe it's a commercial as well. Yeah, it is a commercial. You know, HOAs, condo statement of account, buyer typically pays exit tax. I don't know if anybody, you know, this is the big thing that people complain about in New Jersey, and people are saying, if you've been living in a house in New Jersey and you are selling your house and moving to Delaware, North Carolina, whatever you're going, you're not paying an exit tax. Selling your primary residence, it's an exemption to it. The people that are paying the exit taxes are the ones that have been, lived in New Jersey, moved to North Carolina, using their Jersey house as a rental, and are paying taxes in North Carolina, so the North Carolina residents. They're the ones that are paying the exit tax. You know, where do they live? Where are they from? As long as they've been out, the house. They lived there 2 out of the last 5 years, and as a primary residence. You know, there's different exceptions, but you don't want to scare potential sellers who are moving out of state. It's fine. You know, if you live here, you're moving out, that's the exit tax. And that is kind of, time of the essence. Yeah, paragraph 8. In South Jersey, you will not be able to get rid of time of the essence. Basically, if this is the date and you don't close by that date, or you don't do your inspections by that date, you waive your rights. This is also why I think that closing dates need to be reasonable. You know, like if it's doable, I get these things 2 weeks for closing, sure, and you got a mortgage, absolutely, it happened. So there's language that we use in our South Jersey deals. If that language is there. That's it. Any questions, concerns?
Question. So if you're not using, say someone's not using an attorney for the contract, but you said even during the 3-day, well, even in the beginning, they can't cancel the contract.
No.
So we have to reach out to attorney if the buyer doesn't want to cancel the contract
Yes.
and have them
Yep.
send a letter and cancel.
Yep.
Okay. And then the second one was, if you're not using an attorney, is there any way to get around the title? Doesn't it say like buyer or seller pays half of the title charges or something?
They split the settlement fee.
Yeah.
So like, if I'm representing, if I'm representing the buyer and the seller doesn't have an attorney, split the settlement fee, because that's what the contract says.
Right.
If nobody has an attorney, you should absolutely split the settlement fee. No one's doing any of the stuff and managing for the seller. It's $525. It's not going to make or break the deal. It's not a big deal, but yeah. But you gotta, we'll do that. If you're representing the buyer and there's an association involved, typically an attorney review will say the buyer has to pay for the statement of account from the association. If the seller doesn't have an attorney, the condo statement says that the seller has to pay for it. If I have sellers that don't have an attorney, make the seller pay for it because they didn't change the addendum. Seller doesn't have an attorney, the contract says that if there's termites, there's an affirmative obligation to treat and repair damage. Seller has an attorney, the attorney says it's, you have to do it up to a certain amount or it's optional. Seller doesn't have an attorney and you have radon in the house, buyer can walk away. They don't have to ask you to treat it because the contract says that. There's certain things that we change, a lot of things that we clean up. PA contracts are very different than New Jersey contracts. If any of you are PA agents, I'm licensed in both. PA contracts are like 30 pages long, and they deal with every single possible contingency that comes up. New Jersey contracts aren't. So, guys.
Thank
Cards, my name's on these things, and, you know, if you have any questions, whether I'm on your file or I'm not, you know, feel free to give me a call. I've been doing this for a really long time. I work with a lot of new agents, and, you know, use me as a resource. And I think it makes it better for everybody, buyers, sellers, attorneys, everybody to, you know, make sure we try to do it as best as we can.
You use Stellar Center? Glad you are.